more than 6,000 years ago, before the first pyramid stone was ever set in place, before kings ruled by written law, before history had a name for itself, a civilization claimed that the world had already been destroyed once. Not by gradual decay, not by slow collapse, but by a deliberate return to water, a reversal of creation itself. Clay tablets pressed by human hands recorded a time when heaven and earth were torn apart, when gods argued over labor, when humanity existed before agriculture, before clothing, before cities, and yet somehow before kingship descended from the sky. Why would the earliest writers of human memory insist that time itself once behaved differently? Why would they describe rulers who lived tens of thousands of years not as fantasy, but as accepted truth? Why would the gods they described feel exhaustion, irritation, even sleeplessness because of human noise? Why would creation be portrayed not as a perfect act, but as an experiment filled with correction and compromise? And why, if these stories were only myth, do they align so precisely with real rivers, real floods, real cities buried beneath layers of silt? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. Before anything resembling a sky arched overhead or solid ground could be imagined beneath human feet, existence was described as water without edges, depth without bottom, movement without direction. The earliest Sumerian scribes did not begin their account of reality with gods walking upright or speaking commands. They began with something closer to a condition than a being. They called it Namu, a word that does not comfortably translate into modern categories. She was not water as a substance that could be held or poured, but water as an idea, as the raw potential from which all form could eventually arise. To picture it, imagine an endless dark ocean without waves, without surface, without horizon, not moving through space but existing before space itself had meaning. For the people who lived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, water was not an abstraction. It was the difference between survival and annihilation. When the rivers flooded gently and on time, fields turned green and cities flourished. When they flooded violently or failed to arrive, famine followed. Water created life and erased it with equal indifference. So when Sumerian thinkers reached backward beyond memory to imagine what existed before the world took shape, water was the only force vast enough, powerful enough, and unpredictable enough to explain everything that followed. Namu was described as self-generating, a concept that can be understood by imagining a fire that needs no spark or a seed that contains its own soil. Unlike later gods who were born through unions or conflicts, Namu required no partner. She did not act through command or speech, but through emergence. From her essence came the first distinction, the earliest hint that reality might separate itself into parts. She brought forth An and Kai, heaven and earth, not as places one could visit, but as opposing principles. Heaven was the vast above, the unreachable dome. Earth was the dense below, the heavy foundation. At first, they were not divided. They existed pressed together, inseparable, like clay before it hardens. This early vision of the universe lacked space as humans experience it. There was no air to breathe, no distance for light to travel, no room for motion. Everything existed in a compressed state of potential. The Sumerian language struggled to describe this condition, using phrases that suggest both physical closeness and total unity. Heaven and earth were not merely touching, they were one mass. Nothing could live there, not because it was hostile, but because it was unfinished. Change came through rupture. From the union of heaven and earth emerged Enlil, whose name carries the sense of wind, breath, and moving air. His defining act was separation. The texts describe this moment not as gentle unfolding, but as force. Heaven was thrust upward, earth pressed downward, and between them opened a space that had never existed before. That space was air, the invisible medium that allows sound to travel, storms to form, birds to fly, and lungs to fill. Creation, in this telling, required violence, not as destruction, but as the breaking of unity into difference. With this act, time as humans recognize it could begin. Before separation, there was no before or after, only existence suspended. Afterward, events could unfold. The sky became a realm of lights that moved in patterns. The earth became a surface that could be shaped, planted, and built upon. The air became a domain of breath and weather, capable of sustaining life, but also destroying it through wind and storm. This three-layered structure was simple, yet it matched what the Sumerians observed every day when they looked up, down, and around themselves. Beneath the earth, however, water remained. The Sumerians believed that below the solid ground stretched the Abzu, an underground ocean of fresh water feeding springs, wells, and rivers. This belief was not mystical guesswork. In the Mesopotamian plain, digging almost anywhere eventually reaches water. From this repeated experience, generation after generation concluded that the land itself floated upon a hidden sea. The Abzu was not separate from Namu, but a continuation of that primordial state, a reminder that order rested atop chaos and could never fully escape it. This understanding shaped how cities were built and worship was practiced. The city of Eridu, considered the first city in the world, stood near what was once the shoreline of the Persian Gulf. Its temple was dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, and was believed to sit directly above a point where the Abzu touched the human world. To stand in that temple was to stand at the seam between creation and what came before it. Rituals performed there were not symbolic gestures alone, but acts meant to maintain balance between the structured world above and the restless waters below. The earliest gods that followed were not distant rulers issuing decrees from the sky. They were forces assigned to maintain stability. Some governed rivers, ensuring they flowed without destroying fields. Others oversaw crops, animals, or crafts. The universe was imagined as something that required constant attention, like an irrigation system that would collapse if neglected. Order was not permanent, it was maintained through effort. Within this framework, humanity did not appear as a crown of creation. Humans arrived later, created not out of love or admiration, but necessity. The gods themselves were burdened with labor. They dug canals, shaped land, and built foundations. The texts describe them complaining, growing exhausted, even rebelling against the endless work required to keep the world functioning. This divine dissatisfaction led to a solution that would permanently alter existence. Humans were formed from clay taken from the edge of the Abzu, mixed with divine essence. Clay was chosen because it was neither solid stone nor flowing water, but something between, capable of being shaped and hardened. This choice explains how the Sumerians understood human nature. People were made of the same substance as bricks and pottery, fragile yet durable, formed rather than born whole. The divine element gave consciousness, while the clay anchored humanity to labor and mortality. From the beginning, creation was experimental. The gods did not produce a flawless model. They adjusted, tested, and adapted. Some humans were strong, others weak. Some could work the fields, others could not. Instead of discarding those who did not fit a single purpose, roles were found for them within society. This reflects a worldview that saw value as functional rather than idealized, and order as flexible rather than fixed. This early universe was not governed by moral absolutes. Disasters did not happen because of sin, but imbalance. Floods occurred when water overwhelmed boundaries. Drought followed when flow was disrupted. The same water that birthed the world could reclaim it without warning. This understanding would later shape how the Sumerians interpreted catastrophe, kingship, and memory itself. What matters most in these earliest accounts is not whether they align with modern science, but that they represent humanity's first attempt to explain existence through observation, experience, and imagination bound tightly together. They show a people who understood that civilization rested on unstable ground, both literally and cosmically, and that beneath every city, every temple, and every human life, the primordial waters were still waiting. Once the sky had been forced upward and the earth pressed downward, the space between them did not remain empty for long. Air, newly born, carried movement, and movement invited change. In this widening gap between heaven and ground, the Sumerians imagined the earliest rhythms of existence taking shape. Wind began to move without being summoned. Clouds gathered and dispersed. Sound traveled for the first time. Breath became possible. This was not yet the world of humans, but it was no longer the silent compression of the primordial state. The cosmos had begun to stir. The separation initiated by Enlil did more than create physical space. It introduced hierarchy. Heaven rose above as a realm of authority and distance, while earth settled below as a place of weight, labor, and growth. The air between them became contested territory, the zone of storms and seasons, capable of nurturing life or destroying it without warning. Enlil claimed this middle realm as his domain, not ruling gently but forcefully, through tempests and winds that reminded all beings of his presence. To live under the open sky was to live under his influence. Time itself was reshaped by this division. The movement of the sky introduced cycles. The sun traced a path across the heavens, marking day and night. The moon waxed and waned, offering a slower rhythm that governed months and rituals. These celestial motions were not decorative. They were mechanisms by which time became measurable. Before them, existence had no countable duration. Afterward, days could be remembered, seasons anticipated, and history recorded. The Sumerians did not view these patterns as automatic. They believed they required oversight. The gods born after the separation were assigned responsibilities, much like officials in an administration. One watched over rivers, ensuring that water arrived when needed and withdrew before it destroyed the fields. Another governed crops, overseeing germination and harvest. Others protected livestock, crafts, or city walls. This vision of the universe resembled a carefully managed estate, where neglect in any area could lead to collapse. Within this ordered complexity, the Abzu remained below, unseen but ever present. Fresh water rose from it through springs and wells, reminding humans that beneath the solid ground lay something ancient and restless. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, ruled this hidden realm. Unlike Enlil, whose power was expressed through force, Enki's influence was subtle. He appeared as a problem solver, a god who understood systems rather than commanding them. When something broke, Enki found a way to fix it without tearing the whole structure apart. This contrast between Enlil and Enki shaped the character of the early cosmos. Enlil represented authority and enforcement. Enki embodied ingenuity and adaptation. Together, they reflected two approaches to maintaining order, one through command, the other through understanding. Humanity would later find itself caught between these forces, benefiting from both and suffering under each in different ways. Before humans fully entered the scene, the gods themselves experienced strain. The world they had created required constant maintenance. Canals needed digging, silt needed clearing, and structures needed reinforcing. The junior gods, those lower in the divine hierarchy, were tasked with this labor. Over time, resentment grew. The texts describe them groaning under the weight of their work, their complaints echoing through the cosmos. This detail reveals a startling feature of Sumerian thought. Even gods could tire. Their exhaustion was not framed as rebellion against creation itself, but against inequity. Some gods commanded, while others labored endlessly. This imbalance threatened the stability of the cosmic order. If the workers refused their tasks, canals would clog, fields would dry, and cities would fail. Creation, it turned out, was fragile not because of chaos, but because of fatigue. Namu, the primordial source, reappears at this critical moment, not as creator, but as mediator. She gathered the complaints of the laboring gods and brought them to Enki, who was resting in the depths of the Abzu. This image is striking. Wisdom asleep beneath the world, while the structure above strained under its own weight. Namu's intervention was not dramatic. She did not issue threats or commands. She presented a problem and demanded a solution. Enki's response was not to punish the workers or redistribute tasks among the gods. Instead, he proposed something unprecedented, the creation of a new being designed specifically to bear the burden of labor. Humans were not imagined as companions to the gods, nor as rulers of the earth. They were a solution to a logistical problem. Their purpose was practical, rooted in the needs of an overworked divine system. The materials chosen for humanity reveal how the Sumerians understood this role. Clay taken from the edge of the Abzu was shaped and infused with divine essence. Clay could be molded, dried, broken, and reshaped. It could hold form, but was never permanent. By choosing clay, the gods created beings capable of work, but destined to wear down. Mortality was not a punishment, it was a design feature. The infusion of divine essence gave humans consciousness and awareness. This element distinguished them from animals, allowing them to understand instructions, organize labor, and perform rituals. Yet this divine spark did not grant equality with the gods. Humans existed between realms, bound to earth through their clay bodies and connected to the divine through borrowed essence. This in-between status defined their place in the cosmos. Creation did not stop with the first successful humans. The texts describe further experimentation, producing individuals with various limitations. Some lacked sight, others strength or coordination. Rather than discarding them, Enki assigned each a role suited to their abilities. This aspect of the myth reflects an early recognition that society functions through diversity of contribution rather than uniform perfection. With humans in place, the gods withdrew from manual labor. Canals were dug by human hands, fields were tended by human effort, temples rose through human construction. Offerings sustained the gods, completing a cycle in which humans maintained the world and the gods maintained order. This arrangement was not depicted as exploitative, but as necessary. Each realm depended on the other. Yet beneath this apparent balance lay tension. Humans multiplied, cities expanded, noise increased. The very success of this system would eventually become a problem. The seeds of catastrophe were planted not in rebellion or disobedience, but in prosperity itself. For now, however, the world held together, balanced precariously between sky, earth, and the waters below, sustained by labor, oversight, and the uneasy cooperation of gods and mortals. As human labor replaced divine toil, the world entered a new phase that felt stable on the surface but carried subtle fractures beneath it. Fields expanded outward from riverbanks, canals stretched like veins across the plains, and settlements thickened into cities. These changes did not unfold gradually in the Sumerian imagination. They were understood as a sudden acceleration, a rapid filling of space that had once been empty. Where silence had dominated the early cosmos, sound now rose continuously. Tools struck earth, animals cried in pens, voices echoed through narrow streets. Civilization announced itself loudly. Kingship emerged within this expanding human world, not as an invention, but as a transmission. The Sumerians believed authority descended from the sky fully formed. To understand this idea, imagine a crown lowered from above rather than forged by human hands. Rulers did not claim power through conquest or agreement, they received it. This belief anchored political authority to cosmic order. A king ruled not because he was strongest, but because the gods had placed him there, temporarily acting as a bridge between realms. The earliest rulers were remembered as belonging to a different order of existence. The Sumerian king list records names that reigned for spans so vast they defy ordinary comprehension. Tens of thousands of years were attributed to single kings. These figures ruled before the Great Flood, in a time when the boundary between divine and human was thinner. Their longevity was not explained biologically, it was cosmological. Time itself behaved differently then, flowing slowly, stretching moments into centuries. This pre-flood age was imagined as closer to creation, less diluted by repetition. The first kings ruled cities that carried symbolic weight. Eridu stood as the prototype, the first place where order crystallized. Bad Tibira was associated with metalwork, the transformation of raw stone into tools. Sippar became a center of justice and light under the sun god. Shuruppak marked the final threshold before catastrophe. Each city represented not just a location, but a stage in humanity's integration into the ordered cosmos. As generations passed, human presence intensified. Population growth brought energy, trade, and innovation, but also density. The Sumerians described this growth in terms of sound. Noise became the measure of success. Bustling cities were loud cities. Yet what humans experienced as vitality, the gods experienced as disturbance. The same air that carried prayers upward also carried clamor into divine realms. Enlil, ruler of wind and authority, found himself unable to rest. The texts describe him lying awake, irritated by the constant din rising from the earth. This portrayal strips divinity of distance and perfection. Gods felt annoyance. They desired quiet. Their patience had limits. Human civilization, in fulfilling its assigned role, had become too effective. The divine response did not stem from moral outrage. Humans were not condemned for corruption or betrayal. Their fault was excess. They multiplied beyond comfort, filled the world beyond tolerance. The gods convened and debated solutions. Famine and disease were attempted as corrections, but humans adapted. They endured. Each adjustment failed to reduce the noise permanently. The decision that followed was absolute. A flood would erase the problem by resetting the world. Water, the original substance of creation, would reclaim dominance. Fields would vanish. Cities would dissolve. The earth would return to silence. This was not framed as punishment, but as maintenance. When a structure grows unstable, it must be dismantled. Enki alone opposed the finality of this plan. His objection was not rooted in sentimentality. Humans served a function. They maintained temples, provided offerings, and sustained the divine economy. Eliminating them entirely would recreate the labor crisis that had prompted their creation. Enki's solution was preservation through exception. Bound by divine law, Enki could not openly defy the decree. Instead, he communicated indirectly. He warned a single man, Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak, chosen not for virtue, but position. Ziusudra stood at the end of the old age, a hinge between eras. Enki instructed him to build a vessel capable of surviving the coming deluge. The instructions were precise, though partially lost to time. The boat was to be sealed against water, loaded with living creatures, stocked with provisions. This was not a rescue of humanity as a whole, but of potential. Life would continue through fragments. Diversity mattered more than number. When the flood came, it arrived with total force. Winds howled from every direction. Rain fell without pause. Rivers overflowed their banks, merging into a single, vast expanse. The plains disappeared beneath water. Cities, once centers of order, dissolved into indistinct shapes. The noise ceased. For 7 days and nights, the waters dominated. The boat was thrown about like driftwood. Outside, the world returned to a state resembling its earliest condition, undifferentiated and fluid. The act of separation that had made life possible was temporarily undone. When calm returned, light pierced the clouds. The sun reappeared, marking the reemergence of time. Ziusudra opened the vessel and stepped into a transformed world. His first act was sacrifice. Offerings were made not in celebration but acknowledgement. Survival was not a triumph. It was a responsibility. The gods themselves reacted with mixed emotions. Enlil, seeing that humanity had not been entirely erased, expressed anger. Enki defended his actions, arguing necessity. A compromise was reached. Humanity would continue, but altered. Lifespans would shorten. Boundaries would harden. The closeness of gods and humans would diminish. This marked the true beginning of historical time. The world after the flood was quieter, smaller, more constrained. Kings would reign for decades rather than millennia. The divine would withdraw, becoming less accessible. Humans would inherit a world no longer fresh from creation, but shaped by loss. Memory of the earlier age persisted in myth and list, not as nostalgia, but as explanation. The impossible rains, the flood, the noise of cities all served to describe a transition from a world of proximity to one of distance. Humanity remained bound to water, clay, and labor, but the gods retreated into abstraction. The cosmos endured, not because it was perfect, but because it adapted. Creation was not a single moment, but a series of corrections, each responding to imbalance. The flood was not an ending, but a recalibration, ensuring that the fragile structure of existence could persist, quieter now, but still standing. After the waters withdrew and the ground hardened once more, the world did not return to what it had been. The silence that followed the flood was not the pristine stillness of beginnings, but a cautious quiet, as if existence itself were testing its balance. Humanity emerged into a landscape stripped of excess. Cities would be rebuilt, but their foundations carried memory of destruction. The air still moved, the rivers still flowed, yet something had changed in how time pressed forward. The age of proximity between gods and humans had ended. The Sumerians understood this shift not as abandonment, but as regulation. The gods had not vanished, they had stepped back. Divine presence became mediated through temples, rituals, and signs rather than direct interaction. Where once gods walked close enough to hear human noise as irritation, now communication required structure. Prayers were formalized, offerings followed prescribed patterns, access to the divine became conditional. Lifespans shortened dramatically. The long-lived rulers of the pre-flood age gave way to kings whose reigns could be counted in decades. This change was not treated as tragedy, it was necessity. Shorter lives meant faster succession, quicker adaptation, and reduced accumulation of power. Humanity was no longer allowed to linger too close to divinity. Kingship persisted as a divine institution, but its nature evolved. A king was no longer a semi-divine figure stretched across mythic time. He became a steward, ruling within limits imposed by both gods and mortality. Authority still descended from heaven, but it landed more lightly. A ruler's legitimacy depended on maintaining favor through ritual correctness and public order rather than sheer longevity. The cities rebuilt after the flood reflected this new condition. Walls rose higher, not only for defense against enemies, but against water itself. Drainage systems grew more elaborate. Floodplains were managed with greater caution. Human memory of destruction translated into engineering. The mythic past became instruction for practical survival. The gods reorganized their roles accordingly. Enlil retained authority, but exercised it through omens and natural forces rather than direct decree. Enki continued to act as mediator, offering guidance through dreams, symbols, and priests. The divine bureaucracy became more complex as direct oversight diminished. Specialized priests emerged, trained to interpret signs, recite formulas, and maintain cosmic balance on humanity's behalf. Writing, once a simple record of goods and labor, expanded into a sacred tool. Clay tablets captured hymns, myths, laws, and rituals. Writing became a way to stabilize memory in a world where divine instruction was no longer immediate. To write was to anchor knowledge against loss, to preserve order against chaos. The Sumerians saw themselves as living in a middle age, neither at the beginning nor at the end. They inhabited a world shaped by earlier perfection and earlier catastrophe. This awareness infused their culture with urgency. Nothing was permanent. Cities could fall, rivers could turn hostile, the gods could withdraw favor. This worldview shaped their understanding of justice. Law was not merely human regulation. It reflected cosmic order. Legal decisions invoked divine authority, not because gods dictated outcomes, but because law was seen as a human reflection of universal balance. To judge wrongly was to risk imbalance, inviting disaster. The Anunnaki, often misunderstood in later interpretations, occupied a specific place within this structure. They were not creators or benefactors, but judges, associated with fate and the underworld. Their authority manifested not in daily life, but at its conclusion. Death marked the boundary where their influence began. The underworld itself was not imagined as punishment or reward. It was a destination all shared, regardless of status. Kings and commoners arrived alike. This egalitarian end reinforced the fragility of earthly power. No ruler, however favored, escaped mortality. Rituals surrounding death emphasized transition rather than judgment. Offerings ensured continuity. Names were preserved to maintain identity beyond life. Memory functioned as survival. To be forgotten was to vanish completely. Agriculture, now firmly established, became sacred routine. The cycles of planting and harvest mirrored cosmic rhythms. Festivals aligned with lunar phases and seasonal shifts. These practices did more than ensure food supply. They synchronized human activity with celestial movement, reinforcing humanity's place within the ordered cosmos. The gods granted knowledge gradually. Skills such as weaving, metalworking, and mathematics were considered divine gifts transmitted through tradition rather than invention. Each generation inherited these tools with responsibility to preserve them. Innovation existed, but it respected precedent. Yet beneath this ordered surface, anxiety persisted. Flood myths were retold not as distant legend, but as warning. Each heavy rain carried memory. Each rising river tested confidence in boundaries. Humanity lived with awareness that water still surrounded and supported the world, held back only by fragile structures. This awareness did not lead to despair. It fostered attentiveness. Ritual maintenance, ethical conduct, and civic responsibility were understood as necessary to prevent imbalance. The gods no longer intervened openly, but they responded to neglect. The post-flood world was narrower but more resilient. Humanity learned to operate within limits. The cosmos was no longer fresh clay, but a fired vessel, hardened by heat and water alike. Cracks remained possible, but repair was now a human obligation. In this new age, memory became the most powerful tool. Myths preserved knowledge of origins. Lists recorded succession. Laws fixed expectations. Through these, humanity maintained continuity with the past while adapting to constraint. The Sumerians did not mourn the loss of divine closeness as a fall from grace. They understood it as maturation. Distance created responsibility. Silence created space for human agency. The gods still watched, but they expected humanity to carry more of the burden. The world endured not because it was protected, but because it was maintained. This was the lesson embedded in every rebuilt wall, every canal dredged, every tablet inscribed. Order was no longer guaranteed. It had to be earned, sustained, and remembered. With distance now separating gods from humans, the mechanisms of communication became increasingly symbolic. The divine no longer spoke plainly through presence or direct command. Instead, meaning arrived through patterns, disruptions, and signs embedded within ordinary experience. A malformed birth, an unexpected eclipse, a sudden illness, or an unusually shaped liver examined during ritual sacrifice could all carry messages. The universe itself had become a text, one that required interpretation rather than obedience. Priests emerged as specialists in reading this coded reality. Their role was not to invent meaning, but to recognize it. Trained within temple schools, they memorized long lists of correspondences, linking natural phenomena to divine intent. This was not superstition in the modern sense, but an early system of pattern recognition built from generations of observation. When rivers flooded early or crops failed without obvious cause, the explanation was not randomness, but imbalance, a signal that something in the cosmic arrangement had shifted. The liver held particular importance. As the largest internal organ, and one associated with blood and life, it was seen as a map of the cosmos in miniature. During sacrificial rituals, priests examined its surface for irregularities, believing these marks reflected divine decisions already set into motion. Fate, once decreed, left traces. The task was to see them before consequences unfolded. This approach reveals how the Sumerians understood causality. Events were not isolated. Everything existed within a network of influence, stretching from the depths of the Abzu to the heights of the sky. A neglected ritual, a broken oath, or an improperly maintained canal could ripple outward, eventually manifesting as drought, disease, or political instability. Responsibility extended beyond intention into maintenance. Kings bore a heavy share of this burden. Though no longer semi-divine, they remained accountable for cosmic balance within their cities. A failed harvest was not merely an economic problem. It reflected the ruler's failure to uphold order. As a result, kings invested heavily in temple construction, offerings, and public ritual. These acts were not displays of piety alone, but strategies of governance. Temples functioned as both spiritual and administrative centers. Grain storage, labor organization, and legal arbitration occurred within their walls. The gods were patrons, but humans were managers. This blend of sacred and practical reinforced the idea that order required constant coordination between realms. A temple neglected was a breach in the cosmic system. Writing expanded further into this environment. Records now included omens, rituals, and hymns designed to appease specific deities. Each god possessed preferences, histories, and temperaments. Knowing these details mattered. Enlil responded to authority and respect. Enki favored cleverness and restraint. Inanna demanded intensity and devotion. Interaction with the divine resembled diplomacy more than worship. The Anunnaki maintained their role as arbiters of fate, particularly in matters beyond correction. Once an event passed a certain threshold, intervention ceased. This reinforced a sense of urgency in interpretation. Signs had to be read early. Delay meant acceptance. Fate, once sealed, was not negotiable. The underworld gained greater definition during this period. It was not a place of judgment, but of continuation. Life there mirrored the living world in diminished form. Food was scarce, light absent, and hierarchy flattened. This bleak continuity emphasized the value of life above ground. Mortality was final not because it ended existence, but because it ended opportunity. Ancestral memory became essential. The dead depended on offerings from the living to maintain comfort in the underworld. Forgetting one's ancestors was a moral failure with tangible consequences. This belief strengthened family bonds and preserved historical continuity. Names mattered. Lineage mattered. Memory was sustenance. The flood remained central in ritual memory. Festivals commemorated survival rather than destruction. Water rituals acknowledged both gratitude and caution. Canals were blessed before use. Wells were treated with reverence. Water was never neutral. It was always capable of undoing what it sustained. Agricultural cycles structured time. The calendar aligned human labor with celestial movement. Months were named after festivals or seasonal tasks. This synchronization reinforced the idea that human effort succeeded only when aligned with larger rhythms. To plant at the wrong time was to challenge the cosmos. Despite increased structure, uncertainty remained. The gods were powerful, but not predictable. Their interests could conflict. One deity's favor might provoke another's anger. Navigating this complexity required attentiveness and adaptability rather than blind devotion. Myth served as guide rather than doctrine. Stories preserved examples of success and failure, illustrating principles without codifying them into law. Inanna's descent warned of overreach. Enlil's flood demonstrated the danger of excess. Enki's interventions modeled creative problem-solving. Humanity, in this worldview, was neither victim nor master. It was participant. The world was not designed for comfort, but for balance. Prosperity invited risk. Stability required vigilance. Over time, this mindset produced resilience. Cities rose and fell, but the underlying system persisted. Knowledge passed through tablets and training rather than revelation. The divine receded into structure. The cosmos no longer needed constant divine labor. Humans had inherited that responsibility. In exchange, they gained agency. The price was awareness. To live was to monitor, interpret, and respond. Silence from the gods did not mean absence. It meant expectation. The Sumerians lived with the understanding that the world could fail again. The flood was not unique. It was precedent. Order survived only through care. Every canal cleared, every ritual performed, every law enforced contributed to delaying the next collapse. This was not fear-driven existence. It was disciplined living. The universe, once violently separated, now depended on cooperation to remain intact. Humanity stood at the center of this maintenance, shaped from clay, animated by borrowed essence, sustaining a world that no longer reset itself without consequence. As centuries accumulated and memory settled into ritual, the Sumerians grew increasingly attentive to boundaries, not only the physical borders between cities and fields, but the invisible lines separating realms, roles, and forces. Order depended on keeping things in their proper place. When boundaries blurred, danger followed. This belief shaped how they understood disease, conflict, and even emotion. Excess was not a flaw of character alone. It was a sign of imbalance. Illness, for example, was rarely viewed as purely physical. Pain in the body signaled disruption elsewhere, often traced to broken taboos or neglected obligations. Healing rituals combined practical remedies with incantations meant to restore alignment. Herbs treated symptoms, while words addressed cause. The spoken formula was not magic in isolation. It was a verbal adjustment, a reminder to the universe of how things were meant to fit together. The human body itself was imagined as a system mirroring the cosmos. Breath corresponded to wind, blood echoed water, bones reflected earth. Consciousness carried a trace of the divine spark embedded at creation. To fall ill was to experience internal disorder. To heal was to re-establish harmony. This understanding fostered a holistic approach that tied personal well-being to communal and cosmic health. Conflict between cities followed similar logic. War was not merely competition for land or resources. It represented breakdown in negotiated balance. Before armies moved, omens were consulted. If signs were unfavorable, delay was wiser than force. Victory achieved against divine warning invited future disaster. Even success required caution. Treaties were sealed with oaths invoking gods as witnesses. Breaking an oath was not only betrayal of another city, but violation of cosmic trust. The consequences extended beyond political reprisal. Crops might fail. Floods might arrive. The universe itself would respond. Within cities, social roles were clearly defined. Craftspeople, farmers, priests, scribes, and rulers each served a function. Mobility existed, but role confusion threatened stability. This was not rigid caste, but functional assignment. Everyone contributed to maintenance. Idleness invited imbalance. Women occupied complex positions within this structure. Goddesses held immense power, embodying fertility, warfare, wisdom, and transformation. Human women managed households, participated in commerce, and served as priestesses. Their labor sustained both family and economy. Female divinity was not abstract idealization, but recognition of generative force. Sexuality, like all forces, required regulation. It was powerful and dangerous if uncontrolled. Sacred sexuality existed within temples, not as indulgence, but as ritual reenactment of cosmic fertility. Outside ritual context, excess led to social instability. Balance, not repression, was the goal. Dreams provided another channel of communication. Sleep loosened boundaries, allowing messages to pass from divine realms into human awareness. Dreams were recorded, analyzed, and categorized. Not all dreams mattered, but recurring or vivid ones demanded attention. They offered guidance without direct intervention. Astrology developed as an extension of this interpretive framework. The movement of celestial bodies reflected underlying patterns. Stars were not distant objects, but active participants in fate. Their positions influenced outcomes not by force, but by correspondence. Understanding these movements allowed anticipation, not control. The Anunnaki's association with fate reinforced acceptance of limits. Some outcomes could not be altered. Knowing this encouraged preparation rather than defiance. Wisdom lay in recognizing what could be changed and what must be endured. Education emphasized memorization and precision. Scribes trained for years to reproduce texts accurately. Variation threatened continuity. Knowledge survived through replication. Innovation occurred cautiously, framed as refinement rather than rupture. This conservatism did not prevent growth. Trade expanded across regions. Goods, stories, and techniques traveled along river routes. Foreign deities were incorporated rather than rejected, assigned roles within the existing framework. The system adapted without dissolving. Yet tension persisted between expansion and balance. Prosperity tempted overreach. Larger cities produced louder noise. Memory of the flood lingered as warning. The gods tolerated growth, but excess always carried risk. Festivals served as release valves. Music, drink, and celebration allowed controlled excess within defined limits. These moments relieved pressure, preventing accumulation that might destabilize society. Order included rhythm, not constant restraint. As generations passed, myths accumulated layers. Stories were retold, adjusted, contextualized. Core principles remained: creation through separation, maintenance through labor, catastrophe through imbalance. The details shifted to address new concerns, but the structure endured. Humanity's role solidified as caretaker. The gods no longer built or repaired. Humans did. In return, they received guidance, not protection. The universe was not hostile, but indifferent to negligence. The Sumerians did not seek escape from this condition. They accepted it. Meaning arose from participation, not transcendence. To live well was to observe carefully, act responsibly, and remember constantly. In this worldview, progress did not mean domination. It meant stability. The greatest achievement was continuation. A city that endured generations had succeeded more fully than one that conquered briefly. The cosmos remained layered, ordered, and fragile. Heaven watched. Earth labored. Water waited. Humanity stood between, balancing forces older and stronger than itself, aware that survival depended not on favor alone, but on attention. As time moved forward under the new constraints imposed after the flood, memory became humanity's most fragile and most powerful resource. The Sumerians understood that without deliberate preservation, knowledge dissolved as easily as mud walls under rain. What endured was what was recorded, repeated, and ritualized. This awareness transformed writing from a practical tool into a defensive one, a barrier against forgetting. Clay tablets multiplied. What began as simple tallies of grain and labor expanded into hymns, incantations, omens, legal codes, and myths. Each mark pressed into wet clay was an act of resistance against loss. Once dried or fired, a tablet could outlast its scribe, its city, even its language. Writing became a way to speak across time. Scribes occupied a unique position in society. They were neither priests nor rulers, yet they served both. Trained through years of repetition, they learned to copy texts exactly, preserving not only words but structure. Accuracy mattered more than interpretation. Meaning was embedded in form. To alter a phrase was to risk altering the balance it supported. Myths were copied alongside contracts. The story of creation shared space with records of land sale. This was not contradiction, but coherence. Both described order. One did so cosmically, the other socially. Together they maintained continuity between divine design and human action. The flood narrative, preserved in multiple versions, remained central. Its retelling did not fade into abstraction. It was anchored in geography. Cities named in the story existed in living memory. Ruins beneath newer structures testified to cycles of destruction and rebuilding. The past was not distant. It lay beneath one's feet. This proximity to history shaped how the Sumerians viewed innovation. New ideas were not rejected outright, but they were weighed against precedent. The past functioned as guide. Deviating too far invited instability. Progress was incremental, layered upon what already existed. Genealogy reinforced this continuity. Kings traced their legitimacy through long lines, linking themselves to earlier rulers and, by extension, to divine favor. Even when dynasties fell, the institution endured. Kingship itself was older than any individual. Authority resided in the role, not the person. Time was recorded not as abstract sequence, but as succession. Events were dated by reigns. Memory organized itself around human lives rather than numerical calendars. This personalized history, grounding cosmic time in mortal experience. The underworld gained narrative richness during this period. Poems and hymns described its gates, rivers, and guardians. These descriptions were not meant to frighten, but to define. Death was inevitable. Knowing its contours reduced uncertainty. Fear came from the unknown, not the inevitable. Funerary practices reflected this acceptance. Bodies were buried with offerings not for escape, but sustenance. The dead required care. Neglecting them disrupted familial and cosmic order. Responsibility extended beyond life. Justice systems mirrored this emphasis on continuity. Laws were codified, but flexibility remained. Judges considered precedent alongside circumstance. Law was not static decree, but evolving practice guided by tradition. Trade introduced new pressures. As goods flowed between regions, so did ideas. Foreign customs entered Sumerian cities. Instead of erasing them, the Sumerians integrated them. New gods were adopted, assigned roles, and placed within existing hierarchies. This inclusivity prevented fragmentation. Yet adaptation carried risk. Too much change could destabilize. The balance between preservation and incorporation required careful negotiation. Temples functioned as anchors, stabilizing identity amid exchange. Economic complexity increased. Surpluses allowed specialization. Artisans refined techniques. Metal tools improved agriculture and warfare. These advancements amplified human capacity, but also increased dependency on systems. A failure now affected more people. The gods responded not with direct intervention, but with signs. Omens multiplied in times of strain. Unusual births, celestial anomalies, and environmental irregularities were interpreted as warnings. The universe spoke indirectly, demanding attention. Human response determined outcome. Signs did not dictate fate. They signaled opportunity for correction. Rituals could restore balance. Neglect led to consequence. The Anunnaki's role as judges reinforced this structure. They did not intervene preemptively. Their presence marked finality. Once fate passed into their domain, adjustment ceased. This sharpened focus on early response. Education extended beyond scribes. Oral transmission preserved practical knowledge. Elders instructed youth in farming techniques, seasonal rhythms, and ritual obligations. Learning was communal. Everyone bore responsibility for continuity. Despite this emphasis on preservation, creativity persisted. Music, poetry, and art flourished within defined forms. Variation occurred through interpretation rather than invention. Expression balanced individuality with tradition. This approach produced resilience. When cities fell, survivors rebuilt using remembered patterns. When floods came, levees were reinforced. When rulers failed, successors inherited systems rather than chaos. The Sumerians did not believe they lived at the pinnacle of time. They saw themselves as caretakers in a long sequence, inheritors of a world shaped by gods and catastrophe alike. Their task was not to perfect it, but to pass it on intact. Memory, ritual, and writing formed a triad sustaining this effort. Together they bridged gaps between generations, cities, and realms. Without them, the world risked unraveling. In this way, humanity became the final stabilizing force. Gods withdrew, fate waited, and nature pressed constantly. What remained was human attention, the willingness to remember and repeat, to maintain structures long enough for the next generation to inherit them. Survival was no longer guaranteed by divine presence. It depended on continuity, and continuity depended on memory made durable through clay, voice, and practice. As memory hardened into institution, the Sumerian world developed a refined sense of consequence. Actions were no longer evaluated solely by immediate outcome, but by how they rippled forward through time. A poorly built canal might serve one season, then collapse in the next. A careless oath might hold for a year, then unravel an alliance decades later. The Sumerians lived with an acute awareness that the present was always borrowing from the future. This sensitivity shaped how labor was organized. Work was not only productive, it was preventative. Dredging canals before silt accumulated, reinforcing walls before flood season, repairing temples before visible decay. These acts reflected an understanding that neglect invited catastrophe. Maintenance became a moral practice. To care for structures was to care for order itself. Slavery existed within this system, but it was not the racialized, permanent condition known in later eras. Enslavement often followed debt or defeat and could be temporary. Even so, the institution revealed a tension between necessity and imbalance. Forced labor solved immediate problems but generated long-term strain. Excessive reliance on coercion risked rebellion and divine disfavor. The Sumerians recognized that stability required consent as much as command. Economic life revolved around redistribution. Temples and palaces collected surplus and reallocated it through rations. This centralized system reduced individual risk but increased systemic vulnerability. If storage failed or leadership faltered, many suffered at once. The gods were believed to oversee abundance, but humans managed distribution. Fairness was essential to prevent unrest. Food carried symbolic weight beyond sustenance. Bread and beer were staples, representing transformation through human effort. Grain became bread only after grinding, mixing, and baking. Beer required fermentation, a controlled decay that produced nourishment. These processes mirrored creation itself, raw potential shaped through labor into life-supporting form. Feasting reinforced social bonds. Shared meals marked festivals, treaties, and rites of passage. Eating together was an act of alignment. To exclude someone from a feast signaled rupture. Hunger was not just physical deprivation, but social isolation. Clothing also carried meaning. Wool, spun and woven, represented order imposed on raw fiber. Nakedness signified vulnerability or regression. After the flood, humans clothed themselves not merely for protection, but identity. Garments distinguished roles, genders, and statuses. To wear the wrong attire was to blur boundaries. The body remained central to religious expression. Ritual purity mattered. Certain activities required cleansing. Water washed away not dirt alone, but accumulated imbalance. Bathing before ritual symbolized resetting the self within cosmic order. Music played a subtle but powerful role. Hymns were not entertainment, but instruments. Rhythm and repetition aligned breath, movement, and emotion. Sound, once the cause of divine irritation, was now disciplined. Ordered noise replaced chaos. Music became acceptable vibration, reinforcing harmony rather than disrupting it. Festivals punctuated the year, providing structure to time. They reenacted myths, renewing connection to origins. During these moments, boundaries loosened briefly, roles reversed, excess was permitted under supervision. These controlled disruptions prevented uncontrolled ones. Release preserved stability. Violence, though present, was ritualized. War followed rules. Spoils were dedicated to gods. Killing outside sanctioned contexts carried risk of pollution. Bloodshed disrupted balance and required purification. The aim was containment, not eradication. Children were raised with expectation rather than indulgence. They were future maintainers. Instruction emphasized skill, discipline, and memory. Play existed, but preparation dominated. Survival depended on competence. Animals occupied defined roles. Domestic creatures were partners in labor. Wild animals represented untamed forces. Both were respected. Hunting rituals acknowledged taking life. Overhunting invited retribution. The landscape itself was read as text. Hills, rivers, and marshes carried stories. Certain locations marked divine encounters or past disasters. Geography preserved memory as effectively as tablets. To build in the wrong place was to ignore warning. As cities grew, inequality increased. Elites accumulated resources and influence. This imbalance required justification. The divine mandate of kingship served this function, but only temporarily. Excessive disparity provoked unrest and signs of divine displeasure. Redistribution rituals attempted correction. The gods were not blind to injustice, but their response was indirect. Signs appeared. Outcomes shifted. Human interpretation determined response. Blame could not be placed solely on divine will. Failure reflected human mismanagement. The Sumerians did not imagine an ultimate end of the world. Catastrophe was cyclical, not final. Floods could return. Cities could fall. Renewal followed destruction. This perspective reduced despair but increased vigilance. Death remained constant companion. Life expectancy was uncertain. Disease and accident struck unpredictably. This awareness intensified present responsibility. Each day mattered because it contributed to continuity. In this worldview, meaning did not reside in transcendence, but in maintenance. To live well was to sustain structures inherited from the past long enough to hand them forward. Heroism lay not in conquest, but in preservation. The cosmos no longer needed dramatic creation. It required steady care. The gods watched for negligence more than devotion. Silence from heaven did not imply indifference. It signaled trust placed in human hands. Thus, the Sumerian world moved forward not with optimism or despair, but with resolve. Order was fragile. Balance was temporary. But as long as memory endured and effort continued, the world could remain upright, suspended between waters above and waters below, held in place by human attention. As generations turned and cities layered themselves over older ruins, the Sumerians developed an increasingly sober understanding of power. Authority, they believed, was never permanent. It flowed, settled briefly, then moved on. Even the gods themselves were subject to shifts in influence. This awareness tempered ambition and infused leadership with caution. To rule was to hold something borrowed, not owned. Kings were reminded of this impermanence through ritual humiliation. At certain festivals, a ruler would be stripped of regalia, struck lightly, and made to weep before the gods. These acts were not symbolic theater alone. They were corrections designed to prevent the illusion of invincibility. Power that forgot its limits invited collapse. The city-state remained the fundamental political unit. Each city possessed its patron deity, its rituals, and its identity. Loyalty to the city was loyalty to its god. Conflict between cities therefore carried theological weight. War was not merely territorial, but cosmological, a contest between divine jurisdictions. Yet conquest rarely erased local gods. Victors absorbed them, integrating defeated deities into broader hierarchies. This practice preserved continuity and reduced resistance. Divine systems expanded as empires grew, reflecting political realities without abandoning sacred logic. Law codes crystallized during this period. Though attributed to kings, they invoked divine authority. Laws addressed theft, injury, trade, marriage, and labor. They did not promise equality, but predictability. Knowing consequences allowed society to function despite inequality. Justice was balance, not fairness. Punishments were proportional, not moralistic. Compensation often replaced retribution. The goal was restoration rather than condemnation. Even severe penalties served to stabilize rather than purify. The household became the primary unit of survival. Extended families pooled resources and labor. Kinship networks buffered individuals against disaster. Orphans and widows relied on communal obligation rather than charity. Neglecting them risked imbalance. Marriage functioned as alliance. It linked families economically and socially. Love existed but was secondary. Stability mattered more than sentiment. Contracts formalized expectations, reducing conflict. Children inherited roles gradually. Apprenticeship began early. Skills passed through observation and repetition. Failure to transmit knowledge threatened continuity. Elders carried authority not through power, but experience. Food insecurity remained constant threat. Droughts, pests, and floods disrupted harvests. Grain storage mitigated risk, but never eliminated it. Hunger sharpened social awareness. Prosperity was temporary. Preparedness was essential. Religion adapted to this precariousness. Personal devotion increased alongside institutional worship. Individuals prayed directly for health, success, and protection. Small household shrines complemented grand temples. Faith became intimate as well as communal. Amulets and charms proliferated. They did not replace ritual, but supplemented it. Personal protection addressed anxieties that public rites could not. The divine entered daily life through objects carried on the body. Fear of malevolent forces grew more pronounced. Demons represented disorder rather than evil. They caused illness, misfortune, and madness. Exorcism rituals aimed to expel imbalance, restoring harmony rather than punishing offenders. Mental distress was recognized, though interpreted cosmically. Anxiety, despair, and erratic behavior signaled disruption. Healing involved community support and ritual reassurance. Music and poetry evolved to address these inner states. Laments expressed grief collectively. Mourning was shared, preventing isolation. To grieve alone was dangerous. The gods themselves were subjects of poetry. Hymns praised, pleaded, and sometimes accused. Divine perfection was not assumed. Gods could err. This openness allowed negotiation. Worship was dialogue, not submission. The flood myth retained potency as ultimate reminder. It reinforced humility. Civilization could be erased. The past warned the present. Survival required restraint. Trade expanded across distant regions, bringing wealth and vulnerability. Dependency on foreign goods introduced risk. Disruption of routes could destabilize economies. Interdependence demanded diplomacy. Writing preserved these complexities. Archives recorded treaties, omens, prayers, and grievances. Future generations could access past experience. Knowledge accumulated rather than reset. Despite advancements, the Sumerians never believed they had surpassed their ancestors. Earlier ages were closer to creation. Modernity meant distance, not superiority. Progress was survival, not ascent. This humility sustained endurance. The world was not improving toward perfection. It was persisting against entropy. Each generation's task was maintenance. The gods remained present but silent. Their absence forced maturity. Humanity learned to manage itself within given boundaries. In this steady, vigilant existence, meaning emerged not from destiny but responsibility. The universe did not promise reward. It demanded care. Thus, life continued between flood and silence, between creation and collapse. The Sumerians walked forward carrying memory, laboring within limits, sustaining a world that could not sustain itself. As the Sumerian world matured, attention turned increasingly toward fate. Not fate as blind inevitability, but as a pattern gradually revealed. The future was not fixed from the beginning. It emerged through accumulation. Every action pressed lightly upon what followed, shaping outcomes without fully determining them. Fate was written in layers, not decreed in a single stroke. The Anunnaki embodied this principle. They were not architects of existence, but its final arbiters. Their role began where human influence ended. When a life reached its conclusion, when events passed beyond correction, the Anunnaki received the outcome. They did not punish or reward. They confirmed. This made them feared, not for cruelty, but for finality. This understanding influenced how the Sumerians approached risk. Gambling existed, but rarely recklessly. Ventures were measured. Expansion occurred cautiously. Overconfidence invited intervention. The gods tolerated ambition within limits. Beyond those limits, balance corrected itself. Prophecy emerged as a specialized practice. Certain individuals claimed heightened sensitivity to signs. Their pronouncements were not absolute predictions, but warnings. Prophets interpreted trends rather than foretelling specifics. Their authority depended on accuracy. Failure discredited. Dream interpretation expanded accordingly. Dreams were categorized by clarity, repetition, and emotional intensity. Some were dismissed, others were recorded and analyzed. Sleep opened pathways closed during waking consciousness. Messages passed through metaphor rather than command. Astrology reached sophistication. Planetary movements were charted meticulously. Celestial events correlated with earthly outcomes over generations. This long-term observation created a statistical worldview. Patterns suggested influence without asserting causation. The sky mirrored the earth. Time itself was reimagined. Calendars refined. Intercalary months corrected drift. Human schedules aligned with celestial rhythms. Precision reduced uncertainty. The future became navigable. The underworld remained constant. Its unchanging nature contrasted with the variability of life. Death stabilized fate. Once there, no further alteration occurred. This finality sharpened appreciation for the living realm. Mortuary rituals grew elaborate. Proper burial ensured smooth transition. Improper rites risked haunting. Ghosts represented unresolved imbalance. Appeasement restored order. The living maintained relationships with the dead through offerings and remembrance. Ancestral favor protected households. Forgetting invited misfortune. Memory extended beyond life. Justice increasingly addressed intention. Accidental harm differed from deliberate action. This nuance reflected deeper understanding of causality. Not all outcomes were equal in moral weight. Contracts included clauses anticipating misfortune. Risk management entered legal thought. Contingency became normal. Life was uncertain. Planning mitigated impact. Economic specialization deepened. Merchants traveled far, navigating danger for profit. Their success depended on divine favor and human skill. Trade gods emerged to oversee exchange. Art reflected these complexities. Reliefs depicted processions, rituals, and labor rather than conquest alone. Representation emphasized continuity. Images taught values. Music diversified. Modes corresponded to moods and rituals. Sound shaped emotion intentionally. Order extended into sensation. Education broadened. Literacy spread beyond scribes to administrators and traders. Knowledge empowered adaptation. Ignorance endangered. Women gained visibility in religious and economic roles. Priestesses managed temples. Entrepreneurs ran businesses. Gender boundaries existed but were permeable. Children learned through imitation. Stories transmitted values subtly. Myth functioned as moral instruction without dogma. Disease remained unpredictable. Plagues were interpreted as warnings rather than punishments. Response focused on purification and care, not blame. Environmental awareness sharpened. Overuse of land degraded productivity. Fallow periods restored balance. Sustainability emerged from observation. The gods remained distant but responsive. Silence followed neglect. Signs followed excess. The universe communicated indirectly. The Sumerians did not seek mastery over fate. They sought alignment. Wisdom lay in moving with patterns, rather than against them. This worldview fostered patience. Immediate gratification yielded to long-term stability. Sacrifice served future benefit. The flood myth continued to anchor perspective. Destruction was possible. Survival was conditional. Arrogance was dangerous. In accepting uncertainty, the Sumerians achieved resilience. They built not to last forever, but long enough. They ruled not to dominate, but to maintain. They lived not for transcendence, but continuity. Fate unfolded quietly, shaped by countless small decisions. The Anunnaki waited at the end, not to judge effort, but to receive result. Between beginning and end, humanity labored, watched the sky, remembered the past, and shaped what could still be shaped. As centuries layered themselves into deep cultural sediment, the Sumerians developed a profound awareness of fragility. Not weakness, but delicacy. Civilization was understood as something finely balanced, capable of remarkable complexity, yet always one disruption away from collapse. This understanding shaped how they approached legacy. What mattered was not brilliance in a single lifetime, but coherence across many. Temples stood at the center of this effort. Built and rebuilt on the same sacred footprints, they accumulated history vertically. Each reconstruction respected the alignment and proportions of what came before. Innovation expressed itself through refinement rather than replacement. To erase the past was to sever protection. Continuity anchored divine favor. Offerings followed strict formulas, not because the gods demanded flattery, but because precision mattered. Ritual error risked miscommunication. The divine realm was distant enough that clarity became essential. Exact words, correct gestures, proper timing, all reduced ambiguity. Worship was calibration. The Sumerians believed that disorder entered gradually. Rarely did collapse arrive without warning. Signs appeared first in small things, disputes unresolved, maintenance delayed, rituals rushed. These were not trivial. They were early fractures. Attention could still repair them. This belief fostered communal accountability. Neighbors monitored one another. Elders intervened before problems escalated. Shame functioned as corrective force. Isolation was dangerous. Integration preserved balance. Language itself reflected this mindset. Words carried weight. Oaths were binding not because of enforcement alone, but because speech shaped reality. To speak falsely introduced distortion. Silence, too, had meaning. Withholding truth was imbalance. Poetry preserved emotional truth. Laments gave voice to loss without demanding resolution. Grief acknowledged without explanation prevented resentment. Expression released pressure. Silence was not always virtuous. Festivals of mourning balanced festivals of renewal. The calendar acknowledged both gain and loss. Ignoring sorrow invited stagnation. Remembering it allowed movement. The relationship between humans and gods settled into mutual distance. Neither sought closeness. Boundaries protected both. Gods avoided entanglement. Humans avoided dependency. Interaction remained formal, regulated by ritual. This distance did not diminish reverence. It clarified it. Awe replaced familiarity. Respect replaced intimacy. The gods became forces rather than companions. The Anunnaki remained largely unseen, invoked at transitions rather than daily affairs. Their association with fate reinforced acceptance. Life unfolded within constraints. Some things could not be appealed. The underworld stabilized conceptually. Its predictability contrasted with the variability of life. This steadiness reduced fear. Death was not chaos, but continuation without opportunity. The living realm gained urgency. Craftsmanship reflected these values. Tools were built to last, repaired repeatedly. Disposability did not exist. Objects carried history. Broken items were mended or repurposed. Waste threatened balance. Urban planning mirrored cosmology. Streets aligned with cardinal directions. Gates marked transitions. Movement through the city echoed movement through the universe. Orientation mattered. Public spaces encouraged gathering. Markets were social as well as economic. Exchange built trust. Transparency reduced conflict. Wealth accumulation carried responsibility. Excess demanded redistribution through offerings and public works. Hoarding invited divine displeasure and social unrest. Prosperity was conditional. Education emphasized humility. Knowledge did not elevate above others. It obligated service. Scribes served institutions. Priests served cities. Kings served gods and people. Authority flowed downward, and accountability upward. Foreign influence continued to enter, absorbed selectively. Not all ideas were compatible. Discernment preserved identity. Adaptation without erosion was the goal. Military power existed, but was restrained by ritual. War required justification. Victory demanded thanksgiving and restraint. Excessive cruelty polluted the land. Environmental respect deepened. Over-irrigation damaged soil. Observation led to adjustment. Experience replaced theory. Sustainability emerged through failure. The Sumerians did not imagine utopia. They expected difficulty. Preparation mattered more than hope. Stability resulted from effort, not promise. Time pressed forward unevenly. Some generations prospered. Others endured hardship. The measure of success was endurance, not ease. Myth remained alive, retold in new contexts. Its purpose was guidance, not nostalgia. Stories evolved without losing core meaning. The flood myth persisted as ultimate reminder. Even the greatest structures could vanish. Memory was the only defense. Thus, Sumerian civilization sustained itself through attentiveness. No single element guaranteed survival. Balance emerged from interaction, ritual, labor, memory, restraint. The world did not belong to humans. It was entrusted to them temporarily. Their task was to maintain it long enough for the next generation to inherit something recognizable. Between distant gods and waiting fate, humanity carved out meaning through care. Not certainty, not mastery, but vigilance. In that vigilance, civilization endured. As memory stretched backward and expectation forward, the Sumerians came to view history not as a straight path, but as a surface marked by pressure. Events left impressions. Some were shallow and faded quickly. Others cut deep, shaping generations. The past was not gone. It remained embedded in the present, influencing choices even when unspoken. This understanding altered how mistakes were perceived. Failure was not final. It was instructive. Cities recorded disasters alongside triumphs. Tablets preserved omens that had preceded collapse. Knowledge of what went wrong mattered as much as what succeeded. Wisdom accumulated through error. Rebuilding after destruction followed familiar patterns. Foundations aligned with earlier structures. Names were reused. Rituals re-established continuity. Even when political control shifted, sacred geography persisted. Conquerors ruled through existing frameworks rather than erasing them. The gods themselves were bound by precedent. Divine decisions referenced earlier actions. Consistency preserved authority. Arbitrary behavior threatened credibility. The universe functioned on expectation as much as power. This reliance on precedent influenced justice. Judges consulted past rulings. Similar cases demanded similar outcomes. Flexibility existed, but deviation required justification. Law stabilized social behavior by making consequence predictable. Economic agreements reflected this logic. Contracts specified conditions, penalties, and witnesses. Divine names invoked accountability. Trust extended beyond individuals into institutions. Commerce relied on memory formalized. The role of witnesses was crucial. Seeing and remembering validated reality. Without witnesses, events lost legitimacy. This emphasis reinforced communal presence. Nothing significant occurred unseen. Timekeeping became increasingly precise. Lunar observation improved. Agricultural cycles aligned more tightly with celestial markers. Accuracy reduced risk. Miscalculation threatened harvest. Festivals adjusted accordingly. Dates shifted to maintain alignment. Ritual calendars were living systems, not fixed relics. Adaptation preserved relevance. The Sumerians recognized that knowledge decayed without use. Skills deteriorated if not practiced. Rituals lost power if rushed. Attention sustained efficacy. Neglect weakened structure. Priests functioned as custodians rather than innovators. Their authority rested on fidelity to tradition. Variation risked distortion. Stability required restraint. Yet innovation occurred through necessity. New tools emerged to solve practical problems. These were framed as rediscoveries or gifts rather than inventions. Framing preserved continuity. Children were taught through story and task. Learning occurred in context. Abstract theory held little value. Application mattered. Gender roles remained structured but adaptable. Circumstance altered function. Widows ran households. Priestesses wielded authority. Practicality tempered ideology. Conflict resolution favored mediation. Elders intervened. Escalation threatened balance. Peace was not idealized but preferred. Music and art continued to encode cosmology. Patterns mirrored order. Symmetry reassured. Excess ornamentation invited suspicion. Death rituals emphasized closure. Unfinished business risked haunting. Completion mattered. Proper endings preserved order. The underworld's predictability contrasted with life's uncertainty. This contrast reinforced present responsibility. Opportunity existed only among the living. The Anunnaki's distant presence reinforced acceptance. Fate was not personal. It was structural. Resistance was futile. Preparation was wise. Weather patterns were observed carefully. Flood markers were recorded. Experience guided expectation. Nature communicated through repetition. Environmental stewardship emerged implicitly. Land abused responded poorly. Recovery required patience. Human action had consequence. The Sumerians did not separate sacred and mundane. All action participated in cosmic structure. Small acts mattered. Attention scaled. Writing preserved this integrated worldview. Archives accumulated not to glorify but to remember. Memory defended against chaos. As centuries passed, this system demonstrated durability. Dynasties fell, languages shifted, but underlying principles persisted. The world remained precarious. No illusion of permanence emerged. Stability was temporary. Effort was continuous. In this acceptance, the Sumerians found strength. They did not seek escape from fragility. They learned to live within it. The cosmos did not guarantee safety. It offered structure. Humanity filled that structure with care. Between the silent gods and waiting fate, the present remained the only space of action. Within it, the Sumerians labored, remembered, and adapted, sustaining a world that asked for vigilance rather than faith. As the long rhythm of Sumerian civilization continued, awareness of decline became as important as hope for renewal. The people did not imagine collapse as sudden or mysterious. They believed decay announced itself gradually through subtle failures of attention. When canals were cleared less often, when rituals were shortened, when officials accepted convenience over precision, the world began to loosen. Disorder did not arrive from outside. It grew from within. This awareness shaped moral thought. Right action was not defined by abstract virtue, but by maintenance. A good person upheld balance. A negligent one weakened it. Ethics were practical, grounded in consequence rather than intention alone. Harm came not only from malice, but from carelessness. Leadership reflected this standard. Kings were judged less by conquest than by stability. A reign marked by peace, regular harvests, and intact temples was considered successful even without expansion. Ambition that disrupted balance was failure disguised as strength. Royal inscriptions emphasized restoration. Kings boasted of repairing walls, dredging canals, rebuilding shrines. These acts demonstrated alignment with divine expectation. Creation had already happened. Preservation was the true work of rulers. The gods responded to this orientation by remaining distant but consistent. Favor manifested as continuity. Absence of disaster signaled approval. Divine silence meant equilibrium, not neglect. Mythology reinforced this lesson. Stories of gods punished for excess or arrogance reminded listeners that power invited responsibility. Even deities suffered consequence. The universe did not excuse imbalance at any level. The flood narrative retained relevance precisely because it illustrated ultimate correction. When imbalance grew too great, reset followed. The memory discouraged complacency. Survival required restraint. As cities aged, social stratification deepened. Elites controlled resources. Inequality grew. The system tolerated disparity only within bounds. When wealth concentrated excessively, unrest followed. The gods were believed to notice such imbalance. Redistribution rituals attempted correction. Debt emerged as major destabilizing force. Farmers unable to repay loans risked enslavement. Kings periodically declared debt forgiveness, releasing bonds and restoring land. These acts were framed as restoration of order, not charity. Excessive accumulation threatened the whole system. Law codes evolved to address these pressures. Limits were placed on interest. Protections extended to vulnerable groups. Justice adapted to preserve continuity rather than enforce strict hierarchy. Foreign influence intensified. New peoples entered Mesopotamia. Languages blended. Traditions merged. The Sumerians absorbed rather than resisted, but each integration required adjustment. Identity evolved without dissolving. Religious syncretism followed. Gods acquired new names and attributes. Old functions persisted beneath new forms. Continuity disguised change. This adaptability extended survival. Rigid systems shattered. Flexible ones endured. The Sumerians recognized this and valued integration over purity. Yet adaptation carried risk. Excessive change threatened coherence. Balance required discernment. Not all innovations served stability. Selection mattered. Education emphasized judgment. Knowing when to preserve and when to adapt distinguished wisdom from mere knowledge. Elders guided this process. Art reflected accumulated complexity. Scenes depicted layered narratives. Symbols carried multiple meanings. Interpretation required familiarity with tradition. Music grew more sophisticated. Harmonies mirrored social complexity. Controlled variation expressed evolving order. Religious festivals incorporated historical memory. Past disasters were reenacted to reinforce caution. Renewal followed acknowledgement of fragility. The underworld remained unchanged, anchoring perspective. Life evolved. Death did not. This contrast grounded expectation. The Anunnaki's unchanging role reinforced this stability. Fate awaited all. Variation ended there. This knowledge humbled ambition. Despite awareness of decline, despair did not dominate. The Sumerians accepted impermanence. Effort mattered even if outcome was uncertain. Meaning arose from participation in continuity. Each generation inherited imbalance and addressed it as best it could. Success was partial but valuable. As pressures mounted, the system strained but adapted. New powers rose, old cities faded, but principles endured beneath transformation. The world remained ordered, though never secure. Humanity's task persisted: maintain balance between forces stronger than itself. The Sumerians did not imagine an end to history. They expected cycles. Decline followed renewal. Renewal followed decline. In this acceptance, they found endurance. Civilization did not promise permanence. It offered opportunity to sustain something fragile for a little longer. Between memory and uncertainty, they labored on, shaping order where possible, knowing that vigilance, not victory, defined survival. As external pressures increased and internal cohesion strained, the Sumerians became acutely aware that survival depended on adaptation without amnesia. Change could not be resisted, but neither could memory be abandoned. The balance between these forces defined the late maturity of their civilization. They did not ask whether change would come. They focused on how it would be absorbed. New powers entered the region, bringing different languages, military practices, and social structures. These arrivals were not interpreted as cosmic betrayal, but as shifts within the ordered world. The gods had not failed. Circumstances had changed. Response, not resistance, determined survival. Sumerian institutions proved resilient because they were modular. Temples could serve new rulers. Administrative systems translated across languages. Ritual forms adapted without losing function. What mattered was continuity of practice, not purity of origin. Writing played a crucial role in this transition. Texts were copied in new scripts. Sumerian persisted as a sacred language long after it ceased to be spoken daily. This separation preserved authority. Sacred knowledge remained stable even as spoken culture evolved. Priests became guardians of this inherited language. They did not converse in it. They invoked it. Its distance increased its power. Meaning resided not in accessibility but preservation. Kingship transformed accordingly. New rulers adopted ancient titles and rituals to legitimize authority. Continuity mattered more than lineage. Power clothed itself in tradition to gain acceptance. Law codes were retained, revised, and reissued. Precedent remained authoritative even when context shifted. The law became bridge between past and present. Economically, adaptation intensified. Trade networks expanded. Currency systems evolved. Markets grew complex. Yet redistribution remained central. Excess accumulation threatened stability regardless of era. Social roles shifted subtly. Merit gained importance alongside inheritance. Skilled administrators rose regardless of origin. Competence preserved order. Religion absorbed new deities without collapse. Gods merged, exchanged attributes, or redefined roles. The pantheon expanded while maintaining internal logic. No deity existed without function. This flexibility extended to myth. Stories were retold with new emphasis. Flood narratives incorporated fresh details. Meaning adjusted to context. The underworld remained constant, anchoring worldview. Death ignored cultural change. It equalized conqueror and conquered alike. This continuity humbled power. Environmental challenges persisted. Climate shifts altered river behavior. Floods and droughts intensified unpredictably. Experience guided adaptation. Infrastructure evolved. Ritual calendars adjusted. Festivals shifted timing. Alignment mattered more than fixed date. Precision preserved relevance. Education diversified. New subjects emerged. Mathematics, astronomy, and administration advanced. Knowledge responded to complexity. Despite pressure, the core worldview endured. Order required maintenance. Imbalance invited correction. The gods remained distant, yet responsive. The Anunnaki continued as arbiters of fate. Their role, unchanged by political transformation, reinforced cosmic stability. Power shifted. Fate did not. The Sumerians increasingly understood themselves as ancestors rather than pioneers. Their task was preservation. Legacy mattered more than expansion. Art reflected this awareness. Scenes depicted offering rather than conquest. Maintenance replaced domination as ideal. Music slowed, emphasizing solemnity. Sound expressed endurance rather than celebration. Funerary practices emphasized continuity. Names were preserved meticulously. Forgetting was final death. As foreign dominance increased, Sumerian identity persisted through ritual and memory. Civilization outlived sovereignty. This endurance was not accidental. It was cultivated through restraint, adaptation, and reverence for precedent. The world changed, but its structure remained recognizable. The Sumerians did not disappear suddenly. They dissolved gradually into successors, leaving frameworks behind. Their influence persisted beyond political end. The cosmos continued its cycles. Creation remained distant. Fate waited patiently. Humanity adapted. In this final maturity, the Sumerian achievement was not conquest or permanence, but transmission. They handed forward a way of seeing the world, one grounded in balance, vigilance, and responsibility. Between gods who no longer spoke and futures that could not be predicted, they chose care over certainty. And through that choice, their world endured beyond itself. By the time Sumerian civilization reached its final centuries toggle, the world around it had grown louder and faster, yet its internal rhythm remained deliberate. Empires rose that moved armies farther and ruled territories larger than anything the early city-states had imagined. Languages shifted, gods were renamed, and borders redrew themselves repeatedly. Still, beneath these surface changes, the old Sumerian understanding of existence continued to operate, quietly shaping behavior long after political power had slipped away. What endured was not dominance, but infrastructure of thought. The idea that the universe required maintenance rather than conquest survived every transition. Later, rulers adopted Sumerian administrative practices not out of reverence, but necessity. Accounting systems, legal reasoning, temple economies, and ritual calendars worked. They stabilized complex societies. They reduced chaos. Practical success ensured survival more effectively than ideology. Sumerian myths were no longer told as living memory, but as inherited wisdom. The creation stories, the flood, the long-lived kings before catastrophe, all became reference points rather than immediate truths. Their power shifted from explanation to orientation. They taught how to think about time, not what to expect from it. This transition marked a subtle but profound change. Earlier generations lived within myth. Later ones lived alongside it. The gods became more distant still, not because belief weakened, but because responsibility had fully transferred to human hands. Divine intervention was no longer assumed even in crisis. Planning replaced prayer as the first response. Temples adapted to this reality. They remained sacred, but increasingly administrative. Grain storage, taxation, and record-keeping occupied as much attention as ritual. The sacred and practical merged completely. There was no longer a meaningful distinction between spiritual order and economic order. Both were systems of balance. The priesthood evolved accordingly. Priests became scholars, archivists, and advisors. Their authority rested on memory and interpretation rather than mediation. They preserved tradition not as living revelation, but as accumulated guidance. Knowledge replaced proximity as the source of legitimacy. Kingship continued, but its tone changed. Rulers emphasized protection rather than expansion. Stability became the public virtue. Inscriptions spoke less of divine mandate and more of continuity. A good king preserved what existed. A bad one disrupted balance. The underworld remained unchanged in thought, serving as the final equalizer. No empire altered its structure. Death ended ambition without exception. This certainty restrained excess. Power knew its limit. As Sumerian identity diluted into successor cultures, its worldview persisted invisibly. Ideas about law, fate, labor, and memory embedded themselves into Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian thought. Names changed, structures remained. The flood myth, in particular, gained new resonance. Later cultures retold it with variation, but the core lesson endured. Unchecked growth invites correction, and survival depends on foresight rather than righteousness. Water remained both origin and threat. Writing ensured this survival. Tablets buried beneath ruins waited centuries to speak again. Their endurance exceeded that of palaces and kings. Clay, once shaped from the primordial waters, carried memory across millennia. This continuity revealed something essential about the Sumerian achievement. They did not seek immortality through monuments alone. They sought it through systems. A city could fall, but accounting survived. A language could die, but ritual structure persisted. The Sumerians understood that no civilization remains dominant forever. What mattered was what it left behind. Influence outlasted power when embedded in practice. Even as foreign gods replaced Sumerian names, their functions remained familiar. Storm gods still governed chaos. Wisdom gods still mediated imbalance. Fate still awaited at the end. The roles persisted because they reflected enduring human concerns. Humanity's relationship to the cosmos remained defined by effort. The universe did not guarantee meaning. Meaning was constructed through maintenance. This lesson, born in the floodplains between rivers, traveled far beyond them. The final Sumerians did not experience dramatic collapse. Their world transformed gradually, absorbed into larger structures. There was no single ending, only transition. Yet their core insight remained intact. Existence is not secured by creation alone. It requires vigilance, restraint, and memory. When these fail, correction follows. Later civilizations inherited this truth, whether they acknowledged it or not. They built laws, temples, and economies atop Sumerian foundations, often unaware of their origin. The structure endured because it worked. In this way, Sumer did not vanish. It dissolved into continuity. Its voice grew quieter but never disappeared. Between the silent gods of creation and the final arbiters of fate, humanity continued its task. The Sumerians had defined that task clearly. Maintain balance long enough for the next generation to inherit a world that still stands. That understanding, more than any empire, proved immortal. Long after the last Sumerian voices stopped speaking their language aloud, the structure of their thought continued to shape the world in quiet, durable ways. What survived was not belief in specific gods or loyalty to vanished cities, but a framework for understanding existence itself. It was a way of seeing reality as something neither benevolent nor hostile, but conditional. The universe offered stability only to those who worked to preserve it. This perspective traveled forward through time embedded in systems rather than stories. Law codes that emphasized precedent over impulse. Bureaucracies that relied on record-keeping rather than charisma. Ritual calendars that aligned human labor with natural cycles. These mechanisms did not announce their origin. They functioned invisibly, sustaining societies that no longer remembered where the foundations had come from. The idea that power must be restrained survived every empire that inherited it. Rulers who ignored balance faced collapse. Those who respected limits endured longer. This pattern repeated across centuries, reinforcing the lesson without requiring belief in its source. Even the concept of history itself carried Sumerian imprint. Time was not a narrative of progress, but a sequence of adjustments. Advancement did not guarantee improvement. Survival depended on responsiveness. This humility shaped later philosophies, though rarely acknowledged. The flood myth persisted because it captured this truth more clearly than abstract instruction ever could. Growth without restraint leads to correction. Memory without action leads to repetition. Survival depends not on innocence or virtue, but awareness. This story resurfaced in altered forms across cultures because it addressed a universal condition. Writing remained the most powerful inheritance. The habit of preserving information beyond living memory transformed humanity's relationship with time. Knowledge no longer died with its holders, it accumulated. This accumulation allowed complexity, but also required discipline. Archives could preserve wisdom or propagate error. Responsibility grew alongside capacity. The Sumerians had recognized this early. They treated writing with caution. Accuracy mattered. Preservation outweighed innovation. This conservatism was not fear-driven. It was structural. Stability depended on reliability. Their understanding of fate also endured. Fate was not destiny imposed from above, but consequence unfolding over time. Finality arrived only when intervention was no longer possible. This concept encouraged early action and discouraged fatalism. Acceptance came at the end, not the beginning. The Anunnaki, as symbols of final judgment rather than active control, represented this philosophy perfectly. They did not shape events, they confirmed outcomes. Responsibility rested elsewhere. This quiet placement of accountability within human action echoed through later moral systems. Even the Sumerian view of the divine left a lasting imprint. Gods were not perfect or omniscient. They operated within constraints. They erred, adapted, and negotiated. This portrayal humanized power while preserving awe. It allowed critique without rejection. As civilizations grew larger and more abstract, this balance was often lost. Gods became absolute. Kings claimed divinity. Systems grew rigid. Collapse followed. Each failure reaffirmed the Sumerian insight. Imbalance invites correction. Environmental awareness also traced back to those early floodplains. The recognition that land responds to use, that water must be managed, that neglect compounds over time, all emerged from lived experience. These lessons reappeared whenever societies confronted scarcity. The Sumerians had never imagined themselves as chosen or exceptional. They saw themselves as participants in a fragile arrangement. This modest self-conception allowed adaptation. Arrogance did not anchor their worldview. Responsibility did. When their cities faded and their names were absorbed into others, this humility proved more durable than monuments. Empires collapsed. The idea of maintenance remained. Humanity continued to build, destroy, and rebuild. Each cycle echoed the first separation of heaven and earth, the first flood, the first recalibration. The pattern repeated because the conditions remained. What the Sumerians offered was not prophecy, but orientation. They provided a way to stand within uncertainty without demanding certainty. They taught that order is temporary, balance requires effort, and memory is protection. In the end, their greatest legacy was not a list of gods or kings, but a discipline of attention. Watch the rivers, read the signs, maintain the structures, respect limits, prepare for correction. This discipline does not age. It does not depend on belief. It operates wherever complexity exists. Wherever systems grow large enough to fail, the Sumerian lesson waits. Between origin and collapse, between creation and fate, there is a narrow space where action matters. The Sumerians named that space responsibility. They lived within it, recorded it, and passed it forward. And as long as civilizations continue to rise between waters above and waters below, that space remains the only place where survival is decided.